And we begin tonight with an historic day with President Joe Biden, Union Joe, doing something no sitting president has ever done, walking a picket line. Biden joined striking United Auto Workers in Michigan today, a big effing deal in Biden speak, to close out what's been a summer of labor. More on that a little later in the show. What's also a huge deal is the potential government shutdown in just 4 days. The Senate is working on a short-term measure to buy Congress more time until mid-November, while nominal House Speaker Kevin McCarthy tries to find a way to placate his MAGA fringe. The same fringe that Donald Trump is ordering to shut down the government unless they get everything they want. And what do they want? Weirdly enough, it's the same things he wants: to cut off the funding to his least favorite country and first impeachment cause, Ukraine, to help Russia win the war, and to defund the special counsel who's prosecuting Trump. Weird how those things line up. It's a typically self-serving position for the twice impeached, 4 times indicted former president to play political games with the economic survival of the American people. And a stark reminder of just how dangerously unfit he is to serve and what he would do if he were to return to the White House, reinforced by his other recent threats, like threatening to execute outgoing Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley. General Milley's offense, you'll recall, was making a phone call to reassure China following the siege on the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters on January 6, 2021. In fact, in a recent profile, Milley said he presumed Trump would come after him if he were put back in the White House. Trump's former Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Milley's concerns are a legitimate fear and that Trump would likely throw his perceived political enemies in jail if elected again, underscoring the danger of re-electing a mob boss with a Secret Service escort. A Georgia judge has ordered the names of jurors in the election interference case against Trump be kept secret until the trial ends. All very serious, screaming red flags about the dangers that he poses to our democracy and to individual Americans. And last night, that danger was amplified by someone who saw it firsthand. The January 6th committee's star witness, former White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson, in her first live interview with my friend Rachel Maddow.
This year has helped me open my eyes to the dangers that Trump actually poses on people in these situations. And I'm not the only one. And I wish I could say I'd be the last person, but unfortunately I won't. And that's what he does to people that he thinks that speak out against him or that detract from him. And it's one of the more dangerous things about Donald Trump, too. This is something we've seen time and time again, and it shouldn't have to be like this.
Hutchinson, who maintains she's still a Republican, said she belongs to a different party than the current MAGA gang led by Trump. And she called for more Republicans to join her in speaking out ahead of the next election.
We all want the republic to survive. We all should want the republic to survive. But in the way that Mr. Trump's trajectory currently is going, I'm not confident that he will have it survive. I do not believe that Mr. Trump is a strong Republican. But in this next election cycle, in my opinion, it's the make or break moment for the Republican Party. We're talking about a man who, at the very essence of his being, almost destroyed democracy in one day, and he wants to do it again.
For now, MAGA Republicans are choosing the break-it option when it comes to efforts to fund the government, siding with their Mar-a-Lago boss over their supposed leader in the House, Speaker McCarthy, with Matt Gaetz as the leader of the shutdown brigade, basically a band of radicals holding out with Trump cheering them on. Gaetz reportedly told McCarthy that he had a list of members who'd oppose anything McCarthy put forward, calling them immovable. Meaning, in plain English, Kevin McCarthy can either get right-wingers on board, which he's trying to do by floating massive cuts to the social safety net, like kicking 1 million low-income families off nutrition aid, slashing home heating aid by 70% just before winter, and cutting school lunch assistance by 80%, all to appease his MAGA detractors. Or he could team up with Democrats and keep the government open, which would likely trigger a no-confidence vote also led by Gaetz, which could cost him his precious speaker's gavel. What a box to be in. So, with half of the House of Representatives currently a non-functioning puddle of chaos, Americans have until Saturday night for Congress to figure out a plan to keep the lights on. Joining me now is Charlie Sykes, MSNBC contributor and editor-at-large of The Bulwark, and Sahil Kapoor, NBC News senior national political reporter. And Sahil, I do want to go to you first. You're on the Hill. What is the state of play? How close are they to getting anything like a deal to keep the government open?
Well, Joy, there are two very different states of play in the Senate and in the House. In the Senate, they are moving forward with a bipartisan bill to keep the government open on a short-term basis. The vote was just clocked in at 77-19. They voted to proceed with this. They still have a ways to go before it's passed. But the details of this bill are, I'll say it briefly, it keeps the government open until November 17th on a short-term basis at existing levels. There are about $6 billion in economic and military aid to Ukraine. There's about $6 billion additional in disaster relief funds, and it also extends the FAA's programs and authorities through the end of the year. That also expires at the end of this month if there is no agreement. That's the Senate side. They're in good shape to pass this bill. Unclear if they'll do it by the Saturday deadline because some Republican senators could object to a speedy vote, but they are in good shape to pass it. In the House, it's a very, very different situation. Speaker McCarthy is trying to corral his Republicans to decide what their opening bid should be. They're still fighting over what they should start with in terms of how to negotiate with the Senate, which they still are going to have to do. They're going to have to get it through the Democratic-controlled Senate. They're going to have to get President Biden, a Democrat, to sign it. And they're still at loggerheads over how they proceed. McCarthy's hardliners want a steep series of cuts, some of which you just described, which he's struggling to get through the House of Representatives in his narrow majority. Some of them also say they will not vote under any circumstances to fund the government on a short-term basis, which leaves him in a serious jam. He either funds the government with the help of some Democrats and averts a shutdown, or he keeps his job. And for now, he's chosen to try to keep his job. He's trying to get these bills through, these appropriations bills through the House. Even if he does that, he's still stuck with this question of whether or not to pass a short-term funding bill. 4 days to go, and it's going to be a pretty wild ride, I think, Joy.
One moment to stay with you just a moment, Sahil. There has been people like Catherine Clark, who is the vote counter. She's the House whip on the minority side, has kind of talked about what the price would be of Democrats actually coming to the table and helping. One of the things would be to end the impeachment inquiry. What is the Democratic side saying about what price they would exact from Kevin McCarthy if they've got to provide him the votes to pass a bill?
Right, and this question keeps coming up because the way people like Matt Gaetz are saying a motion to vacate to try to overthrow McCarthy is all but inevitable in the foreseeable future, and Democrats will have a choice to make. Do they support the motion to vacate the Speaker's chair, which, as the party out of power, the minority party would always do that. They would not support a Republican Speaker, but Democrats are now discussing amongst themselves whether they should even entertain this idea. And Joy, I got to say, I'm very, very skeptical. This sounds like an episode, of The West Wing, not something that happens in reality. For Democrats to vote to basically protect McCarthy's job and keep a Republican speaker, they would be risking a primary for themselves. That doesn't play well in even competitive districts. And also, Democrats want a whole series of demands from McCarthy, at least according to the sources I'm speaking to, that he is never going to provide because it would further weaken him with his Republican conference to the point of untenability. They want him to let go of the impeachment inquiry into President Biden, which, by the way, has its first hearing later on this week. They want him to pursue bipartisan government funding levels, and in the words of one aide I talked to, stop letting the crazies run the House. Is McCarthy going to do all of that and keep the support of the conservative base? It's exceedingly unlikely. Democrats said they try to go down this route. They might just be hastening his departure from the speakership.
Okay, I'm not Lawrence O'Donnell, but I'm just going to say this is not the West Wing. This is the stupid West Wing. Charlie, I'm going to bring you in on this. I'm not going to make Sahil comment. I'm going to let you comment on it. This is the stupid West. This is stupid. Because the reality is Kevin McCarthy cannot, from what Sahil's excellent reporting has told me, exactly. Charlie, is that he cannot avoid the motion to vacate no matter what. He's out there right now trying to blame President Biden, saying, let me just play him. This is Kevin McCarthy trying to make himself sound like he's somewhat in charge of something, because he's not. Here it is.
All the president has to do is say, you know what? As one of my fundamental jobs as the president of the United States is to secure a border. So that's not that border is not secure. Secure that border, and we'll be able to keep it all open and keep it all working.
Are you willing to shut down the government if you do not get border security deal?
Let's be very clear. It would not be on us.
Charlie.
Yeah.
There is not a deal. Joe Biden could actually build the wall somehow over the Rio Grande and get Mexico to pay for it, and they would still kick Kevin McCarthy out of the speakership because Matt Gaetz is running for governor of Florida. And kicking the speaker out of his seat and being in charge instead of Kevin McCarthy is part of his campaign. There's nothing, Kevin, and that border thing is just BS. What is happening?
What a fine mess Kevin McCarthy has made. Look, Kevin McCarthy has a choice to make to keep the country running, to keep the government open, or to protect his speakership. And as we know, Kevin McCarthy will opt to protect his speakership. But this was inevitable when he empowered the lunatics, and when he made one compromise after another. It's interesting. He's talking about the fundamental responsibilities of the president. One of the fundamental responsibilities of Congress is to keep the lights on, and he's not doing it. But what's really extraordinary, and listening to the breakdown of all of this is, what is this shutdown about? The executive vice president of the Chamber of Commerce, which is a Republican-leaning organization, says he's thinking of this as the Seinfeld shutdown because it's a shutdown about nothing, because there's no end game. They're not going to get what they want. At a certain point, this is, for people like Matt Gaetz, the fight is about the fight, keeping it going. The more chaos he creates, the better it is for him, no matter how much damage he does to the country. And you're seeing what Kevin McCarthy is willing to do. I mean, Kevin McCarthy is willing. I mean, his speakership hangs by a thread from Mar-a-Lago. He knows what Donald Trump can do with him. And he knows that he has to make one concession after another. But it's never enough, because the point is not to be a governing party for people like Matt Gaetz. It's to create as much chaos as possible, to exact as much pain. The fact that he's willing to go along with the very online extremists in his caucus and cut the kinds of programs that you just listed, you have to wonder, at what point do the moderates in the caucus say, to hell with this, we're not going to go along with all of this? But I don't see how this ends well for Kevin McCarthy, and unfortunately, the rest of us are being held hostage as well.